one of the aspects of war that doesn't get much attention, and very few people ever write about in unit war diaries or in accounts of what took place, was the fact that again and again in wars, a brave officer or NCO will stand up and say, "Right, chaps, let's go for it," and leap towards the enemy. Then a minute or two later, he looked behind him and he found he was all on his own, or he only had a handful of men with him.
Hello. On the 6th of June 1944, the British 3rd Division landed on Sword Beach, Normandy, as they joined Canadian, American and other Allied troops in the liberation of Europe. Progress was not easy for the British troops as they suffered heavy losses, and the objective of the vital city of Caen on day one was not achieved. But what of the experience of soldiers on that day? Max Hastings joins to discuss his new book Sword, which features many accounts of men on the ground to create a wonderfully realistic picture of the Allied invasion. Coming up, I have the history of Test cricket since summer is upon us. I have a history of the ancient world through women, both conversations of which I hugely enjoyed. Plenty more on the way, including Russian spies, the atom bomb and the SAS, so please do share with friends and family, but in the meantime it's me discussing Sword Beach with Max Hastings. Max, great pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Lovely to be here, Oliver.
It wasn't long since we discussed Operation Biting, and you've already produced this fantastic book, Sword. I mean, how I don't know how you do it.
I think probably I'm an old man in a hurry, that there's lots of things I still want to say about war and about soldiers. And I'm very aware that I'm now in my 80th year, and you can't expect to go on forever. And I feel this huge sense of excitement when I think of things that one wants to say, and one just wants to get them down on paper and get them out there before something terrible happens to me. And also, I love doing it. I mean, I don't want to play golf. What I really like doing is reading and writing about the history of war. And what I now do, I've written quite a number of very big books about the Vietnam War, about the Second World War, and so on. But now I'm more interested in micro studies, on trying to zoom in on specific incidents, specific episodes. I've rather lost interest in generals. What I'm interested in now is what it was like, wars in general, or Second World War in particular, for very ordinary people. And one of the stories that I've told in Sword, what made me choose to write about Sword Beach on D-Day, was I was fascinated by this business of the men who landed there being virgin soldiers, that most of them had done nothing except train and exercise and become incredibly bored in England for 4 years between Dunkirk and D-Day. And when they landed, this was the first time they'd heard a shot fired in anger. And what was very different from the First World War, although of course it was a bloodbath on the Western Front, that there was a convention that when units were newly arrived in Flanders or in France, that they'd be sent to a quiet sector of the front for a few days or weeks to experience the least ghastly side of war before they were plunged to its extremities. Now, what happened on Sword Beach and on D-Day was that the British 3rd Division and the accompanying 29th Armoured Division, they were thrust from 4 years of training in England suddenly into the whitest heat of war. And most of them found this an extraordinary, pretty traumatic experience, and who can blame them? And one story that's stuck in my mind, and I've told in the book, was of a commando NCO who suddenly found himself confronted a mile or two inland from Sword, late on the morning of the 6th of June, by a screaming prisoner whom he himself had shot. And this was a teenager from Graz in Austria, as the unit's interpreter discovered. And the commander said to the interpreter, "What's the German word for sorry?" And was told, "Verzeihung." And this commander kept saying, Verzeihung, Verzeihung to this screaming teenage German prisoner. And then the commando turned to the interpreter and he said, "Can you explain to him that I've never shot anybody before?" And to me, these things are fascinating, that it doesn't come naturally, shooting people. It's something that most people find very traumatic. And the other thing, of course, they find very traumatic, you can have all the live fire exercises in the world, and nothing prepares you for the sight of men hideously maimed, suddenly, literally blown apart before your eyes. And what is really tough is to keep going in those circumstances. And another aspect of all this that fascinates me, and I've dwelt on a lot, um, one of the stories which is fairly familiar to people, although I hope I've told it more originally than most, is of the storming of the Merville Battery by the 6th Airborne Division, by 9 Para. Now, this was a shambles of a parachute drop in the middle of the night before D-Day, and the colonel in charge of 9 Para suddenly found himself with only about a quarter of the strength of the battalion expected to take out this German battery. And they charged the battery. They took heavy casualties. They lost about half the men who charged the battery, but they did take it. Now, that was one action in the early hours of D-Day. But then a few hours later, a mile or two away, at a German position codenamed by the British Hillman, that a different battalion of the Suffolks was charged with taking Hillman. They spent 7 hours between their first attack being launched and finally overrunning the battery. And what fascinated me, the fact of Hillman's been obviously known for a long time, and the whole division's advance was held up, waiting for the Suffolks to storm Hillman, because every time anybody tried to get past it, the Germans hosed them with machine gun fire and anti-tank fire. Why did the Suffolks take so long? Well, I looked at the casualties, and they only lost 7 dead, which for a battalion on D-Day was almost nothing. And then I looked more closely at the figures, and almost all those 7 were officers or NCOs. Now, I'm an old cynic, and what that told me, and was confirmed by what I learnt the more closely I looked at the story, was that the officers and NCOs of the Suffolks had been brave men who showed the way and led the way, but they had enormous difficulty in getting their men to follow them. And one of the aspects of war that doesn't get much attention, and very few people ever write about in unit war diaries or in accounts of what took place, was the fact that again and again in wars, a brave officer or NCO will stand up and say, "Right, chaps, let's go for it," and leap towards the enemy. And then a minute or two later, he looked behind him and he found he was all on his own, or he only had a handful of men with him. And this aspect of things, that how difficult it can be to get men to follow you in terrifying circumstances, and especially when they're new to it all. I find this fascinating, and not nearly enough is said or written about it. And I was struck by a quote from an officer who also served in Normandy, not with the Suffolk. But he said that after his experience of the first battles in Normandy, if and when he and his company reached their objective, he looked around and he was pleasantly surprised. He expected to find his platoon commanders and 2 or 3 NCOs and maybe 3 or 4 men with them. But the rest of the company would sort of trickle along later. And this business of leadership and how difficult it can be to get men to follow you, I'm absolutely fascinated by. It's one of many things that I felt that I got new things to say about in Sword.
Yeah, I mean the sheer number of first-hand accounts that I'm reading in the book, it's just extraordinary. But as you say, I mean, so many are conscripted. They're citizens. They've got their basic, usual hopes and fears of a normal bloke on the street, and then they're placed, well, for 3 years or more, waiting to go. And then when they do go, they are into this situation they've never experienced before. But what's interesting is that you write about how, they report back they're pinned down, they can't move,
Well, that's a
because
terrible word, pinned down. It occurs again and again and again. And pinned down can mean almost anything. What it very often means, if you're dealing with troops who are new to battle, is that they're under fire and people are reluctant to get up again. And I can remember from personal experience that when I was a BBC reporter in Vietnam, a very long time ago now, 50 something years, and when I found myself in situations where we were being fired on and one was lying behind a tree, it required a fantastic effort of will to get to your feet and to move in any direction. All one's instincts were that one's legs were jelly and that you stayed where you were. So I've known what it's like to be in the situation that those men were in. Now, another aspect of the story I'm telling, which is also very interesting, what is it reasonable to expect from troops? And there's no one simple answer to that, in that one of the great historians of the campaign in Northwest Europe, the Australian BBC correspondent Chester Wilmot, who wrote one of the great books published umpteen years ago, but still one of the classics, The Struggle for Europe. Now, Wilmot landed with the 6th Airborne Division only a mile or two from Hillman, and he was absolutely withering in his book about how sluggish the Suffolks and some other units were about getting moving towards Caen. And he argued that it was their failure and their sluggishness and their refusal to take casualties to achieve objectives, as the airborne did take the casualties and did achieve the objectives, cost the British Montgomery's great objective of taking Caen on D-Day itself. But I'm raising the question in the book, was it reasonable to ask these guys to take the sort of casualties that you're bound to take in a sort of last-ditch battle, when I don't agree with Wilmot that I don't think we were ever going to get Caen on D-Day itself. There was just too little punch on the Sword Beach front, and there were too many Germans between us and Caen. And I think that 3 Division and the Commandos and 6th Airborne, I think they did very well indeed to achieve what they achieved. And they got to within 3 or 4 miles of Caen, where they were then stuck for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And an awful lot of people died before Caen was taken. But where I don't agree with Wilmot is he's saying if the Suffolks had been willing to lose, let's say, 100 men in order to get Hillman quickly, they could have stormed it in a matter of minutes, as 9 Para did storm the Merville battery. But my feeling is that I don't think anything the Suffolks could have done would have changed the outcome on D-Day as a whole. I don't believe the British could have got Caen. So was it reasonable to ask these guys to take the very heavy casualties to achieve a dramatic result? And again, when I'm studying the history of war, and the British and the Second World War in particular, that British troops will often do all that could be expected of reasonable men. But what they wouldn't do was what the parachute regiment would sometimes do, what the German SS would often do, and do what unreasonable men could. Now, I've sometimes argued in my books that actually the British were sort of, I won't say right about this, it was a source of despair to Churchill that there were not more heroes in the ranks of the British Army. But I sometimes think, well, if British soldiers had been willing to behave like the Waffen SS, then they'd have stopped being the sort of people for whose values the war was being fought. So, yes, it's true that the Suffolks and other units like them were not the equivalent of the Waffen SS or whatever, but probably it was a good thing that they weren't. So these things are not straightforward. And I think it's one of the most interesting questions about war generally. What do you expect from your men in a given situation? And I always remember in a different context, after the Falklands War, where I was as a correspondent, that one day I was at a dinner at which Harold Macmillan was present, and everybody was talking about the Battle of Goose Green. in which the parachute regiment engineers lost, I think, 17 killed. And I remember Harold Macmillan suddenly saying quietly, in my war, a battalion that had lost only 17 killed wouldn't think that it had been in a battle. And so everything is relative. Everything is, and I think it's one of the most interesting questions, if I'm lecturing to serving soldiers now or whatever, that there's no right or wrong answer to this, but one's got to be aware. You've got to be aware there's always the dilemma. What is it reasonable to expect people to do? And what we saw, and what I find so interesting in the story I'm telling on Sword, that you had examples of both kinds. You had examples of some people who did more than could have been asked of reasonable men, and some people who did maybe a bit less.
But if the plan, and we should talk about the plan, but if the plan that Montgomery had put together, and it seems as though Churchill is urging speed, speed, speed. So the plan is to get to Caen day one. I mean, it seems extraordinary now, but if the plan relied on a regiment like the Suffolks, a battalion like the Suffolks to push on through, regardless of casualties, then what does that say for the plan?
It's a good thing to make ambitious plans. In fact, one of the criticisms of Montgomery as a general was often that he wasn't ambitious enough. That, for example, before El Alamein in North Africa in 1942, Montgomery talked about hitting the Germans for 6. Well, in the end, at Alamein, many historians and many soldiers at the time concluded that Montgomery hit the Germans for about 3. But then after that, I won't quite say he let them get away, but he conducted the pursuit after Alamein with an extraordinary lack of conviction, and Rommel was able to withdraw in fairly good order after suffering defeat. So Montgomery was never great at making, and Churchill warned him again and again before D-Day. He said, we're not just seeking to create a bridgehead. This is the invasion of Europe. We need a serious result. And Montgomery promised him. And Montgomery made wildly ambitious promises, I think very foolishly, that it was one thing to make a plan saying our objective is to take Caen on the first day. But he was very rash to convey privately, especially to the American generals, his belief that he could realistically get tanks south of Caen on D-Day itself, because this was not a realistic objective. And yet the Americans always regard him as a bullshitter, always regard him as a man who promised more than he could deliver. And this was emphatically true on D-Day. And I don't think it was ever a realistic objective to get Caen. The point of Caen was not the city, it was that it was a vital road junction. And it was also, it opened the way. Once you were past Caen, you had a lot of open ground ideal for tanks, in which you could hope to launch a big advance. And it would have been great to get Caen on D-Day, but the punch just wasn't there. And one thing that when you contrast Montgomery's briefing before all the generals and warlords, before the king, before Churchill himself, before D-Day, when Montgomery talked about taking great risks to get armored brigades past Caen on D-Day. And yet, in the end, by the evening of D-Day, what you had was as close to Caen as they were going to get that day was one company of the King's Own Shropshire Light Infantry and half a squadron of Sherman tanks of the Staffordshires. And they were very brave, and I find it very moving that, again, the Shropshire's officers, that the company was commanded by a man called Peter Steele, who'd, I think he'd been brought up in Chile, and he, like all the rest of them, had done nothing between 1940 and 44. So there was he on his first day in battle as a company commander, a man with 2 children, and there he was leading his company up to a ridge, the Levisi Ridge, about 3 miles short of Caen. And suddenly they run into German machine guns. And Steele presses on with his revolver and tries to get to the German machine gun, and he's shot down and he's killed. But then one of his platoon commanders I think a man called Watkin, um, and he said stubbornly to his platoon sergeant with him, he said, "We've got to get to the high ground," and he crawled on to try and get past Steele, and he got another yard or two, and then he was shot in the stomach, and his platoon sergeant was actually able to drag him back, and he survived. But I'm hugely moved by the courage those two officers and another officer who was in the division that day. He said afterwards, he said, um, there was a terrific mood among, especially he was thinking of the officers, after so long training and preparing of the search for glory. You wanted to stake out claims, to do your bit to fulfill all the country's hopes of you, and to see, I mean, one battalion of the Lancashire Regiment, which on the beach itself, on the beach, the Lancashires, which were one of the first battalions ashore, and this story is in the book too, they lost 3 out of 4 company commanders and their colonel within the first 5 minutes after landing on the beach. And I think the courage and determination of those officers is hugely moving. And again, Chester Wilmot was very critical of that battalion, that after they got inland from the beach, they didn't do much for the rest of D-Day. And I don't find that too surprising, because if you've lost 3 company commanders and your colonel in the first 10 minutes, then it's not surprising you have some problems with your leadership. And all these things, the story has often been told, but what I'm really writing about in this book, I'm not retelling the story of D-Day, which has been told so often. I'm telling a bit of the story in detail, which I feel illustrates important truths about the nature of war and the nature of the way that people behave at war.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Well, Max, we have a number of American listeners, and so this whole conversation will be of a surprise to some of them, I imagine, who would have thought that the invasion of Normandy was undertaken by them alone. And
well, it always amuses me that Steven Spielberg, I won't say he had a lot to answer for because I'm a great fan, but Steven Spielberg, obviously, because of Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, that yes, there are a lot of Americans who really haven't entirely noticed that the Brits were there as well. But that's the nature of things. And actually, where I have sympathy, I sometimes hear the British complain, why aren't there any British soldiers in Saving Private Ryan? And I say there's a very simple answer to that. Steven Spielberg makes films about Americans for predominantly American audiences. And if we want to do this, we've got to make our own films about the Brits. And of course we don't, because the money and the interest isn't there in the way that it is for. So I'm a huge admirer of Spielberg. And the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan give probably the best visual picture, just as the first part of a Band of Brothers account of thing. It was also terrific. Incredibly vivid, accurate pictures of what it was like. They're just telling American stories. And I very much regret that the British have never really got around to convincingly telling some of these stories themselves. But it's not going to happen now. I mean, there's not the British filmmakers, they're not interested in making heroic films about the British in World War II. They tend to be more interested in making unheroic films about World War II. I know somebody recently, very Peter Jackson, a sort of huge titan among filmmakers, because he made the Hobbit films, and he wanted to make a redo of the Dam Busters. Not that, although personally I think the Dam Busters is so good that I thought it was, but in the end I think the whole project had run into the sand, because there's too much baggage with these things now for people to want that story retold. And the name of Guy Gibson's dog is a great embarrassment to everybody. And also, people realize, and I wrote a whole book about this too, that at the time everybody thought the Dam Busters was that wonderful thing, a bombing raid which only knocked over a dam and it didn't kill a lot of innocent civilians. But now, of course, everybody knows about the hundreds of innocent civilians who died in the floods afterwards, and especially all the concentration camp prisoners who died there and so on. So getting films made about British heroics in World War II is a tough business.
Yes, I think Dunkirk is probably the most recent, and you're right, that's not particularly heroic. I mean, that's a defeat, isn't
I
it?
know Dunkirk. I loathed Dunkirk. I thought it was terrible, but it just bore no resemblance to anything about war in general or Dunkirk in particular, as I've always understood it. But it may be. I'm always trying to look with a sort of the hard eye of reality at war in general and the Second World War in particular. But maybe you've got to make films like Dunkirk if you want anybody to watch them.
I think so. But one of the criticisms I think that Americans make, and it certainly comes out in Saving Private Ryan, is that the British don't get off the beach. And I suppose you touched on that because, you know, a lot of company commanders get killed in certainly one battalion. But is that the reason why were they not unable to shift off?
It was very complicated. First of all, that getting all this armor ashore, and yes, there were criticisms by some officers at the time that the armor was slow to move. But the trouble is, every time they were waiting for the engineers to sweep paths inland. And so what you have by late morning, and I've used an aerial picture from late morning on D-Day in the book, which shows this huge clogged mass of British armor waiting on the beach to get off. But the trouble is, every time tanks strayed off swept paths, they tend to blow a track. And in many cases, often, and when they did so, they held up everything behind them. So the holdups, I think you can argue that there was a lack of determination and grip. One thing that's the sort of thing, again, I'm fascinated by, which not many people write about, is wirelesses. That I'm hopelessly untechnical, but when I was writing Sword, I had an exchange of correspondence with somebody who is an authentic wireless expert, and especially on the wireless of the Second World War. And the British made a pre-war decision about the wavelengths in which they were going to operate their military radios, and they became committed to working with a system which, frankly, was deeply unreliable. It was great. The wavelengths they were operating was great for transmitting wireless broadcasts, meaning through the BBC or whatever, but it was hopeless for military purposes. And both the Americans and the Germans operated on much higher frequencies, and as a result had much more reliable radios. And one of the things that's extraordinary, I've written many times in my books that if you analyze an awful lot that goes wrong in wars, a huge amount, even as recently as the Falklands, let's say, is down to failures of communication. Well, this was certainly true on D-Day, where all sorts of things that might have happened if the divisional commander and the brigade commanders had been able to exercise grip, but they couldn't because the wirelesses were working so badly. Half the time they didn't know what was going on. And to give an example, Dempsey, who was the Second Army's commander, the overall commander, Dempsey wrote on D+1 on June the 7th that he still had very little idea what was going on Sword Beach or behind it, because the communications were so poor. Well, actually, on D-Day, one of the things that happened, one of the follow-up brigade that landed, their brigade commander was just about to go and give orders to the brigade when a German mortar bomb landed near him and blew up half his brigade group and wounded him, and he was out of the battle. Well, his deputy was at that moment over at what's now called Pegasus Bridge, liaising with the Airborne Division. And it was hours before he could be got back to take over command of the brigade. Now, this is D-Day, the afternoon of D-Day. What did that brigade do for the next few hours? The answer was absolutely nothing, because there was nobody to grip it. And I find it extraordinary that General Rennie, who commanded 3DIP and was ashore and not far away, that he didn't hear about this and do something about it. But at every turn, you see sluggish British movements. Communications are very often at the heart of it. And so this failure of British wirelesses, which dogged so much, and remember, only a couple of months later, 2 or 3 months later at Arnhem, exactly the same problem, that one of the fundamental reasons for the British failure of the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, there was a calamitous communications breakdown. And it is extraordinary, but the trouble was they knew by the summer of 1944, they knew that American wirelesses were far more effective and that the British had a serious problem, but they decided you simply couldn't at that stage, when you were dealing with millions of men and with huge, you couldn't re-equip the whole British Army with wirelesses on different wavelengths. So you had what I think it's fair to say about what happened on D-Day. We must never forget the big picture, that it was a notable achievement that the Allies, British and American, got ashore, overcame the German coastal defenses, established a beachhead. But on the downside was the sluggishness. Yes, there certainly was. Partly just the friction of war, the problems of getting all this stuff ashore on the first day. Secondly, huge breakdowns of communication. Thirdly, not everybody wanted to be a hero. And fourthly, there were failures of leadership too. And I'm afraid I do think there were a lot of pretty average British divisional and brigade commanders there that day. And in fact, one of the stories I tell in the book is of one brigade commander who was responsible for the brigade that was supposed to get to Caen. And he was a pretty feeble guy, pretty sorry for himself. He was always in a nervous, oh dear, what shall I do frame of mind all through D-Day. He was relatively old, he was in his mid-40s, and he hesitated for long periods about what to do and where to go. Anyway, a few days after D-Day, Montgomery came to visit the beachhead and demanded this bloke's sacking because he told him he was too old for the job, but actually it wasn't a matter of being too old. Montgomery was livid that he'd failed to get to Caen on D-Day. And another officer wrote in his diary that one of the saddest sights he'd seen was this broken man crouched in the back, hunched in the back of a jeep, being driven away in disgrace to back to England. And in fact, the brigadier himself, the sack brigadier, wrote in his little memoir of his thing, he said, as Napoleon was sent to St. Helena after losing the Battle of Waterloo, he said, I was sent to Madagascar. And he was sent to Madagascar to become senior British officer on Madagascar for failing to take Caen on D-Day. And that story, as far as I know, has never been told in any of the previous books. And when you start, one does find, what I never stop being surprised by, is how many fascinating stories have somehow never quite got into the books.
Well, there's one fascinating character, and I know we're running out of time. So before I let you go, I really wanted to discuss Charles Banger King.
Oh, yes.
Marvelous fellow who writes a letter to his Batman's mother before D-Day. I think assuring her that he wouldn't send his company into some kind of suicidal attack because, that wouldn't help anyone.
This officer who was, because he was killed later in the war, that he'd become not quite a forgotten figure, but he was a company commander in the East Yorks, and he was nearly 40. He was very old for that role, regular officer. And he was very unusual, very, very unusual, because I don't think he was brain of Britain. I don't think he was ever going to be a general, but he was an enormously decent, conscientious, enthusiastic, and his men adored him. For instance, he was a bachelor and certainly didn't have much money, but when he inherited a small legacy, and this is back in England before D-Day, he spent a chunk of it on buying a drink for his whole company. And his men adored him, and he was on the run into the beaches. He did write a small page of history by standing up in his landing craft and reading to his men the passages from Henry V about the great Agincourt speech from Henry V. And of course, it was a sort of ludicrous thing to be doing at that moment as German shot and shell storm, but it earned him his place in history. And some people like that, who do things like that. And he was an exuberant, extravagant figure. And he was always shooting his mouth off. And in one of his rueful letters to one of his men's wives, he said, maybe the fact that I can't keep my mouth shut is why I'm still a major, because he was quite old in his rank. And it's perfectly true. I doubt whether he would have risen above major. But when they got onto the beach, Bangor King showed that he was no bullshitter. He really did lead the way. He was constantly urging the men on, pushing them on, driving them on, and he got them off the beach inland by sheer force of personality. He went on through the days and weeks that followed. He was extraordinary, inspirational leader, and he was second in command of the battalion by early 1945, when in the middle of the night, one day he was just taking forward ammunition in the middle of the night to company commander, and his jeep ran over a mine and he was killed. And it's very unusual. People say, oh, well, the whole battalion mourned the loss of so-and-so. Actually, most soldiers are pretty hard-nosed, and they don't long mourn the death of anybody on the battlefield, because they just recognize this is what happened. But they felt that he'd become a legend, and he'd become a legend because he was this very unusual thing. He was very brave. He cared passionately about his men. And it is heartbreaking that he died so close to the end of the war. But he was a genuine hero whom hardly anybody has heard of. And yet his story is terribly moving. And as you say, he wrote very moving letters to his batman's mother, telling her how well her son had done and this sort of thing. Not many officers found time to do that. And he was not, I say he was never going to be a general. I doubt if he would ever have made colonel, but he was rather wonderful.
Yeah, won two DSOs as well, I think.
Yes, he did. And he was, but I'm always interested in finding out about people who hugely deserve recognition from posterity and haven't had it. And you find, there are other examples that I was terribly moved in another book I did when I was writing a mention of an Arctic convoy on which a British cruiser was badly hit and sinking. And it so happened that the senior engineer officer on that cruiser happened to be on the upper decks when the ship was hit. But he said, after the ship was hit and known to be sinking, and he said, I must be with my men. And he was last seen disappearing down below to die with his men in the engine room. And those sort of people are very rare, and they're very often forgotten. And if I'm doing one good deed, and I wouldn't claim to do too many good deeds, it would be to try to focus just a little bit of the light of posterity on people like that and on Bangor King.
Well, that's certainly what is throughout this book, Max. So thank you very much for coming on to discuss it. And of course, for listeners, the links are in the show notes. Max, thank you.
Huge pleasure, Oliver.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.